Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. On a peaceful summer night in 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, was forever changed when 8 people, including 6 children, were brutally murdered in their beds. The killer moved through the Moore family home with calculated precision, armed with nothing but an axe and the cover of darkness. The house still stands today, a silent monument to one of America's most notorious unsolved mass murders. The question remains, who was the phantom killer that turned a quiet Sunday evening into a nightmare that would haunt this community for generations? Tonight, we'll explore the devastating details of the Villisca axe murders. In the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, during the early hours of June 10, 1912, one of America's most horrific and perplexing mass murders took place. A crime so brutal that it would haunt this small Midwestern community for generations to come. 8 innocent people, including 6 children, were bludgeoned to death with an axe while they slept in their beds. The victims were Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, and 2 young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger. The Moore family had spent that Sunday evening at a Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, a joyous occasion that would tragically become their last public appearance. The morning of June 10th began like any other in Villisca. Mary Peckham, the Moores' next-door neighbor, stepped out to hang her laundry around 7 a.m. She noticed something unusual. The Moore house was completely still. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the morning chores, which Sarah Moore typically attended to promptly, remained undone. The chickens hadn't been fed, and the milk delivery man's bottles sat untouched on the porch. After several hours passed with no sign of life from the house, Mary Peckham's concern grew. She approached the house and knocked on the door. Silence. She tried the door handle. It was locked. This was particularly unusual for Villisca, where most residents rarely locked their doors. Something was terribly wrong. Mary called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, who arrived with a spare key. Upon entering the house, Ross discovered a scene that would forever change the peaceful fabric of Villisca. The victims lay in their beds, their faces covered with bedclothes, their heads crushed by repeated blows from an axe. The weapon, which belonged to Josiah Moore, was later found in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters had been sleeping. The killer had methodically moved through the house, room by room, attacking each victim as they slept. The investigation revealed that all windows had been covered with dark cloth, suggesting the murderer had planned their actions carefully. Even more chilling was the discovery that the killer had likely hidden in the attic, waiting for the family to return from the church program and fall asleep. The crime scene held other disturbing details. A plate of uneaten food sat on the kitchen table. All the mirrors in the house had been covered with clothing. The killer had taken the time to fill a basin with water and wash their hands, leaving behind a bloodied piece of cloth. They had even searched through the icebox and apparently helped themselves to a plate of leftover food. Word of the murders spread quickly through Villisca. By noon, hundreds of townspeople had gathered around the Moore house. Unfortunately, this would prove disastrous for the investigation. The crime scene was hopelessly contaminated as curious onlookers wandered freely through the house, some even taking souvenirs. Important evidence was trampled, moved, or simply disappeared. The initial investigation was led by Villisca Marshal Henry Hank Horton, who was quickly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crime. He requested assistance from the county sheriff and eventually from Detective James Wilkerson of the Burns Detective Agency. The investigation would later involve numerous private detectives, county officials, and even Scotland Yard. Several suspects emerged in the immediate aftermath. Among them was Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and Iowa state senator. Jones had previously employed Josiah Moore at his implement store, but Moore had left to start his own business, taking valuable business connections with him. This created bad blood between the two men, and some believed Jones had hired someone to kill Moore. Another early suspect was William Blackie Mansfield, a cocaine-addicted serial killer who was known to have committed similar axe murders in other Midwestern towns. The pattern was strikingly similar: families killed in their beds with an axe, mirrors covered, and faces wrapped in bedclothes. However, Mansfield was ultimately cleared when it was proven he was in Illinois at the time of the murders. Perhaps the most compelling suspect was Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, a traveling preacher who had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church the evening before the murders. Kelly had a history of mental illness and had been seen studying the Moore family during the church service. He would later provide investigators with details about the crime scene that hadn't been made public. Kelly's behavior in the days following the murders raised suspicions. He sent anonymous letters to investigators and wrote detailed articles about the murders for various newspapers, including information that only the killer could have known. When questioned, Kelly gave conflicting accounts of his whereabouts on the night of the murders. In 1917, Kelly was arrested and tried for the murders. During interrogation, he allegedly confessed to the crimes, providing a detailed account of how he committed the murders. However, he later recanted his confession, claiming it was coerced through aggressive questioning and threats. His first trial ended in a hung jury, and he was acquitted in a second trial due to lack of evidence. The investigation would continue to pursue various leads and theories over the years. Some believed the murders were connected to a string of similar axe murders that occurred across the country between 1911 and 1912. Others suggested the killer might have been a disgruntled former employee of the Moore family, or possibly someone who had a personal vendetta against them. The murders transformed Villisca from a peaceful farming community into a town plagued by fear and suspicion. Many residents moved away, unable to cope with the tragedy and the constant reminder of the unsolved crimes. Those who stayed were forever changed by the events of that June night. The aftermath of the Villisca axe murders left an indelible mark on the community's psyche. Neighbors who had once left their doors unlocked now double-bolted them. Parents who had previously allowed their children to play freely outdoors kept them close at hand. The town's sense of security had been shattered, and a cloud of suspicion hung over everyone. The investigation continued to uncover disturbing details about the crime scene. Detective Wilkerson noted that the killer had displayed an unusual level of preparation and patience. They had disabled the home's electrical system by unscrewing the bulbs and removing the key components of the fixtures. This suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with electrical systems, a detail that would become significant in later investigations. One of the most haunting aspects of the crime was the evidence suggesting the killer had spent considerable time in the house after the murders. Investigators found that someone had gone through the family's clothing, methodically searching drawers and closets. Several items of Sarah Moore's clothing had been laid out on a bed, as if the killer had been examining them. A piece of Sarah's undergarment was found in the attic, leading investigators to believe the killer may have taken it as a trophy. The murder weapon itself told a chilling story. The axe, which belonged to Josiah Moore, had been found in the room where the Stillinger sisters were killed. It had been wiped clean, but traces of blood were found on the handle. The killer had used both the blade and the blunt end of the axe, suggesting a frenzied attack. Medical examiner Dr. F.S. Williams estimated that each victim had been struck between 20 and 30 times, far more force than necessary to cause death. Further examination of Lena Stillinger's body revealed something even more disturbing. Unlike the other victims, her nightgown had been pushed up, and there was evidence suggesting sexual assault may have occurred after her death. This detail was initially kept from the public, but later emerged during Reverend Kelly's trial. The investigation into Reverend Kelly revealed a troubled past that made him an increasingly compelling suspect. Born in England, Kelly had a history of mental illness and had spent time in various institutions. He was known to peers as an eccentric figure who showed an unhealthy interest in young girls and had been dismissed from several churches for inappropriate behavior. During his time in Villisca, Kelly had been staying at the Villisca National Bank building directly across from the Moore house. Witnesses reported seeing him staring at the Moore home for extended periods. In the days following the murders, Kelly began writing detailed letters to law enforcement and newspapers, describing the crime scene with uncanny accuracy. One particularly incriminating piece of evidence was a letter Kelly wrote to his mother in England, dated June 12, 1912. In it, he described the murders in detail, including information that hadn't been made public. He wrote, 8 people murdered in their beds. The whole town is in a terrible state of excitement. Children's brains beaten out with an axe while they slept. The most brutal murder in the history of Iowa. During Kelly's interrogation in 1917, Detective F. Jones employed what was then a novel technique. He had Kelly act out the murders using dolls placed in a model of the Moore house. Kelly's demonstration showed an intimate knowledge of the crime scene and the sequence of the killings. However, his subsequent recanting of his confession and the lack of physical evidence ultimately led to his acquittal. Another theory that gained traction involved the possibility that the murders were connected to the railroad. Villisca was a railroad town, and several similar axe murders had occurred in communities along the railroad lines. The theory suggested that the killer might have been a railroad worker, able to move between towns unnoticed and familiar with the layout of railroad communities. One such suspect was Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, a serial killer who had committed similar axe murders in Missouri and Kansas. Like the Villisca murders, his crimes involved entire families being killed in their sleep with an axe. However, while Henry Lee Moore was convicted of other murders, he was never conclusively linked to the Villisca case. The investigation also explored the possibility that the murders were connected to organized crime. In the early 1900s, Iowa had a significant underground network involved in illegal activities. Some speculated that Josiah Moore might have witnessed or become involved in something he shouldn't have, leading to his family's murder as a warning to others. The coverage of the murders in the press was extensive and often sensational. The Des Moines Register ran daily updates on the investigation, and newspapers across the country carried stories about the Iowa horror. The publicity attracted numerous private detectives and self-proclaimed psychics to Villisca, each claiming they could solve the case. One such detective, James MacDonald, spent years investigating the murders and developed an elaborate theory involving a conspiracy of prominent Villisca citizens. He believed that Frank F. Jones had hired professional killers to murder the Moore family. MacDonald's investigation resulted in a grand jury hearing, but no indictments were ever issued. The Moore house itself became a source of ongoing controversy. After standing empty for several years, it was eventually sold and occupied by other families. However, numerous residents reported strange occurrences, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and a persistent feeling of being watched. These stories contributed to the growing legend of the Villisca axe murder house. The paranormal reports surrounding the Moore house continued to multiply over the decades. In 1994, Darwin and Martha Lynn purchased the property and restored it to its 1912 appearance, opening it for tours and overnight stays. Visitors have reported hearing children's voices, seeing floating orbs of light, and experiencing unexplained cold spots throughout the house. These supernatural claims have added another layer to the already complex legacy of the murders. The investigation files, which span thousands of pages, reveal several other persons of interest who were never fully cleared. Among them was Reverend George Kelly's wife, who some investigators believed might have known more than she revealed. During questioning, she provided inconsistent accounts of her husband's whereabouts on the night of the murders, though she maintained his innocence until her death. One particularly intriguing lead involved a man named Sam Moyer, a former farmhand who had worked for the Moore family. Moyer had been fired by Josiah Moore several months before the murders for inappropriate behavior towards Sarah Moore. Multiple witnesses reported seeing someone matching Moyer's description lurking near the Moore house in the days leading up to the murders, but he was never located for questioning. The investigation also uncovered a curious detail about a telegram received at the Villisca telegraph office on the morning after the murders, before the bodies were discovered. The telegram, sent to an unknown recipient, contained the cryptic message, "The deed is done." The sender was never identified, and the telegram's recipient never came forward. Detective Wilkerson's personal notes, which were discovered decades later, revealed his growing frustration with the political interference in the investigation. He wrote, "Certain powerful individuals in this town seem more interested in protecting their reputations than finding the truth. Evidence disappears, witnesses change their stories, and leads that point toward prominent citizens are quickly dismissed." The Scotland Yard detective who consulted on the case, Edward Carson, developed an interesting theory about the killer's psychology. In his report, he wrote, "The methodical nature of the crimes, the covering of mirrors, and the post-murder activities in the house suggest someone who was enacting a ritual rather than committing a crime of passion or financial gain. The killer appears to have derived satisfaction from creating an atmosphere of horror rather than from the acts of violence themselves." One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case was the impact on the surviving members of the Moore and Stillinger families. Ross Moore, Josiah's brother who discovered the bodies, never fully recovered from the trauma. He moved away from Villisca within a year and reportedly suffered from severe depression until his death in 1928. The Stillinger parents were particularly devastated by the loss of their daughters, Lena and Ina. They had only allowed the girls to stay at the Moore house that night because they were close friends with the Moore children and had begged to attend the Children's Day program. The guilt and grief eventually led to the dissolution of their marriage. The investigation files contained dozens of letters from citizens claiming to have information about the murders. One particularly detailed letter, received in 1934, came from a woman in Kansas who claimed her late husband had confessed to the murders on his deathbed. While investigators followed up on this lead, they found the woman's story contained several inconsistencies with the known facts of the case. The axe murders had a profound effect on law enforcement procedures in Iowa. The contamination of the crime scene led to new protocols for securing murder sites and preserving evidence. The case also highlighted the need for better coordination between local and state law enforcement agencies, eventually contributing to the formation of the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation. The Moore House became a focal point for both historical research and paranormal investigation. In 1999, a team of forensic experts used modern technology to examine the house, discovering blood traces that had gone unnoticed in 1912. These findings suggested that the killer might have injured themselves during the attacks, though without DNA testing capabilities in 1912, this potential evidence was lost forever. The psychological profile of the killer, developed by modern criminal profilers reviewing the case, suggests someone with significant local knowledge but possibly transient in nature. The profile indicates a male between 20 and 40 years old, likely with religious preoccupations given the covering of mirrors, a common practice in some religious traditions, and the timing of the murders following a church service. The modern psychological profile also noted several other significant behavioral aspects of the killer. The fact that they chose to attack after a church event, potentially having observed the family during a religious gathering, suggested someone who might have been struggling with issues of morality and religious guilt. The profile indicated that the perpetrator likely had experience with breaking and entering, given their ability to move through the house undetected and disable the electrical system. The handling of evidence in the case has become a textbook example of how not to conduct a murder investigation. Modern forensic experts who have studied the case note that crucial evidence was lost due to the contamination of the crime scene. Blood patterns that could have provided valuable information about the killer's movements and physical characteristics were disrupted by the crowds of onlookers who trampled through the house. In 2004, a team of cold case investigators discovered several overlooked witness statements in the original case files. One particularly interesting account came from a railroad worker who reported seeing a man carrying what appeared to be an axe, walking along the tracks in the early morning hours of June 10, 1912. The man was described as wearing dark clothing and moving quickly away from town, but the witness's statement had apparently been dismissed at the time. The investigation also revealed that several other potential suspects had never been fully investigated. Among them was a traveling salesman named Charles Myers, who had been in Villisca the day before the murders. Myers had a history of violence and had been suspected in similar crimes in other states. However, he disappeared shortly after the murders and was never located for questioning. One of the most compelling aspects of the case was the killer's apparent familiarity with the Moore house. They knew exactly where to find the axe, which was typically kept in the coal shed. They also seemed to know the layout of the house well enough to navigate it in complete darkness. This suggested someone who had either been inside the house before or had observed it carefully over time. The case has continued to fascinate criminologists and historians, particularly because it occurred at a pivotal moment in American law enforcement history. The early 20th century saw the emergence of modern investigative techniques, but many of these were not yet widely available or understood. The Villisca murders highlighted the need for professional crime scene investigation and standardized procedures. The social impact of the murders extended far beyond Villisca. The case became a symbol of the vulnerability of small-town America and the end of an era when people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked at night. It marked a turning point in how rural communities viewed their safety and security. Recent historical research has uncovered additional details about the aftermath of the murders. Town records show that Villisca's population declined significantly in the years following the crimes. Many families, particularly those with young children, chose to leave rather than live with the constant reminder of the tragedy and the fear that the killer might return. The Moore House, which still stands today, continues to draw visitors from around the world. While some come seeking paranormal experiences, others are drawn by the historical significance of the site. The house has been preserved as it was in 1912, providing a haunting glimpse into one of America's most notorious unsolved crimes. In 2017, a group of forensic archaeologists conducted a detailed survey of the property using ground-penetrating radar. While they didn't uncover any new physical evidence, they did discover several anomalies in the soil around the house that suggested items might have been buried there in the past. Unfortunately, multiple construction projects over the years had disturbed much of the surrounding area. The legacy of the Villisca axe murders continues to influence modern true crime investigation. The case is often studied by law enforcement trainees as an example of how crucial proper evidence handling and crime scene preservation are to solving violent crimes. The mistakes made in 1912 serve as valuable lessons for contemporary investigators. The psychological impact on the survivors and their descendants has been documented through various interviews and family records. Many descendants of the Moore and Stillinger families have reported feeling a persistent sense of unease about the unsolved nature of the crimes, with some describing it as an inherited trauma that has affected multiple generations. The intergenerational trauma from the Villisca murders manifested in various ways. Sarah Moore's sister, who had been particularly close to the family, reported that her own children grew up with an intense fear of the dark and refused to sleep without multiple lights on in their rooms. This fear was passed down through stories and family memories, creating a ripple effect of anxiety that touched even those born decades after the murders. The case has also become a significant part of Iowa's historical record, with state archives maintaining extensive collections of documents, photographs, and physical evidence related to the murders. These materials continue to draw researchers and historians who hope to shed new light on the century-old mystery. One particularly interesting document that emerged in recent years was a letter written by a Villisca resident in 1932, describing a deathbed confession they had witnessed. The confessor, whose name was redacted from the letter, allegedly provided details about the murders that aligned with the crime scene evidence. However, like many leads in this case, the information couldn't be verified due to the passage of time and the death of potential witnesses. The Moore house's reputation as a haunted location has led to numerous paranormal investigations over the years. In 2014, a paranormal investigator was actually injured during an overnight stay when he allegedly stabbed himself with a knife while in an altered state. This incident added another layer to the house's dark history and led to increased safety measures for overnight visitors. Modern criminal profilers who have studied the case suggest that the killer likely committed other murders that were never connected to them. The level of sophistication shown in the Villisca murders, from the disabling of the electricity to the methodical way the crimes were carried out, indicates that this was likely not the perpetrator's first violent crime. The impact on law enforcement practices extended beyond Iowa. The Villisca case became a reference point for the development of criminal investigation procedures across the Midwest. The mistakes made in handling the crime scene led to the implementation of stricter protocols for evidence collection and witness interviewing. Time has not diminished the significance of this case in American criminal history. The Villisca axe murders represent more than just an unsolved crime. They mark a moment when American society began to lose its innocence. The murders shattered the notion that rural communities were immune to the kind of violence typically associated with big cities. Today, the Moore house stands as a silent witness to one of America's most notorious unsolved murders. While we may never know the true identity of the killer, the impact of their actions continues to resonate through time, serving as a reminder of how a single night of violence can forever change a community and echo through generations. The case remains officially unsolved, and while many theories have been proposed over the years, none have provided a definitive answer to the question that has haunted Villisca for over a century. Who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters? The truth, like the killer, vanished into the dark Iowa night, leaving behind a mystery that continues to captivate and disturb people to this day.